All right, a lot of you guys won't care, but for those of you who do and are wondering, dude, like, where's the wrap up? It's been a couple months since I've done one. I didn't read that many books per month over the last few months to I think, warrant a monthly wrap up. But one thing led to another, and now I have a pile of books to talk about. Whoops. So let's go ahead and do my monthly wrap up catch up. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Theo. Thanks for hanging out with me. I have my monthly wrap up catch up. It's been a couple months, like I said, since I've done one of these. So let's go ahead and get through them. I'm going to start with November. Now, some of these books I'm going to have had a dedicated video review, not many of them, but some of them. Some of them I may link to other videos where I included them in maybe a top 5, top 10 list, blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to give you enough to let you know what I thought, maybe my rating, whatever. And for the ones where I do a deeper dive in another video, I'm going to link you over there. The first book I wanted to talk about in the month of November was Kingdoms of Death by Christopher Rocchio. This is book number 5 in the Sun Eater series. This, at time of recording, is my favorite Sun Eater series book that I've read. I have not yet read Ashes of Man, although I own it up on the shelf over there. The reason for that is because we got some news that the last book, or I should say the 6th book, is going to be delayed. We also got news of some publisher changes and stuff. Very interesting. You can check out Rocchio's channel for some info and behind the scenes stuff there. But in terms of delay, I just thought I wanted to keep something on deck that I could go back and read from Christopher Rocchio, because if I read it, then it's gone and then I'm waiting for the next one. So I have one Sun Eater book ready to go as soon as I want to go into the next one. I also heard that for people that really like Kingdoms of Death, this one might be difficult for this book to follow Kingdoms of Death. For me, Kingdoms of Death was my favorite book so far. So I don't want to go into something that's going to be a little slower or maybe a build up for the next book. And I feel like this one might be a bit of a slower book. I could be wrong. If you've read it and I'm wrong, let me know and urge me to read it. But I think coming off of something so awesome and coming from the favorite book in the series, I wanted to keep the next Ashes of Man book just like on deck so that I can read it and then quickly, or at least look forward to the next book shortly thereafter. So that's why I've put it off. This book was on my top 5 of 2022. I will go ahead and link that video because I'm going to refer to it here and there in the description below. This book was on it. It had everything I wanted. It had some relationships that came back around. It had some action. It was incredibly dark, lots of emotion to it, lots of impactful scenes, lots of like suspense and tension buildup. We have like space travel. I think we bounce around on a couple different planets. There's a ton going on and it was really fast paced. And I just ended up getting to the end of that book thinking, holy shit, I cannot wait to get to the rest of the series. So for me, from what I can remember, and again, I may do a more dedicated review, but I did go a little bit more in depth in my top 5 list of 2022. I just thought it was the best installment. I really liked it. It happens to be the only edition that I have signed, which is kind of cool because it is my favorite. It's one of the shorter ones because I believe that this one was split up. And yeah, I really liked it. Sun Eater continues to be a sci-fi series that I'm invested in and that I would highly recommend if someone, is looking for a space opera, something very political with a lot of drama, a lot of action. It's a slow start with Empire of Silence, but once you get that momentum, it's really hard to put down and it's really fun. It's incredibly well written. I mean, Christopher Rocchio's prose is super impressive. He knows how to write. He knows how to structure things. And for being very poetic and almost flowery, not in a bad way, but like flowery, beautiful writing. It's not just beautiful. It's like technically very well done. It doesn't get bogged down and it actually flows and reads really well. So yeah, I really liked it. 5-star book, easy 5-star, one of my top 5 of 2022. And I really enjoyed it. The next book that I read in November was actually the 5th season. And that one took me a while to read. If you guys remember, it was chosen on like a TBR swap kind of challenge for like September. Took me 2 months to get around to it, but I did. And I read it. And this one is very interesting because the more I sit on this one, the more I think I didn't like it as much as I thought I would. I know a lot of people love this book. I know this has won awards and Kay Jemison is an absolutely like accredited author and people just love these books and love her writing. I gave it 4 stars, and I was sort of rounding up in my head from like a 3.5. Now for this one, I ended up doing a dedicated review. I'm going to put up maybe the thumbnail or link to the video. If you don't see it there, it'll be in the description. I think that I liked more things in that review than I did now thinking back to it. Does that make sense? The more I sit on this one, the more I think maybe I was just coming off of that high of like finishing a book, glad I finished it, you know, thinking of the good moments. But the more I think back about it, the more it's sort of, to me, a book with really good, relevant ideas, quite thought-provoking, but almost done in a forgettable type of way. I ended up not really, at least now, caring or thinking too much about the characters or the world, which at the time was interesting. There's an atmosphere there that's created. She does a very good job with that. The writing was okay. It was accessible. I thought the writing was decent actually, but it just, you know, there were some choices that she made that left me like not super impressed or, eager to continue at times. But yeah, this is one where I think hindsight is different, and I don't think I like this one as much as I maybe thought I would. So right now, I think I'm going to keep my rating as 4 stars. And if you're curious about maybe some specific thoughts very quickly after finishing the book, you can check out my dedicated review. But again, my thoughts have changed on that one. And this series as a whole, again, I've only read the first book to date. I still have only read the first book. And this one continues to get kind of bumped down my priority list. I own the whole trilogy, but for some reason, it just is not a book that I am eager to go and pick up again. So for now, it is what it is, 4 stars. It was all right. And yeah, I'm not really thinking about it much anymore, unfortunately. Next, I ended up reading finally something by Joe Hill. This is Stephen King's son. This is Joe Hill King or Joe King Hill or whatever. And I read the very short story. I think it was only 20 pages of The Black Phone. I have yet not watched the Netflix adaptation or show or movie. I think it was a movie. This one is basically about a young boy that gets kidnapped, and he's in this basement, doesn't really know what the hell's going on. And in the basement, there's a black phone, and it rings, and he answers it and gets like calls from, I don't want to spoil it. This one is very easy to spoil, so I'm not going to say much more than that, but it's supposed to be a very dramatic and, suspenseful kind of horror story. And for me, I ended up giving this one 3 stars. It was the first Joe Hill book that I've ever read. Sorry, I have a tag popping up at my neck that I needed to fix right this moment for some reason. I wanted to read Nosferatu around Christmas time. I also wanted to read Heart-Shaped Box, I believe is the title, as well as Horns. So those are the 3 that I keep gravitating towards and eyeballing. I wanted to read this one as sort of a short sample of his writing. And I must say, guys, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. This is pretty impressive writing. It felt very Stephen King. It was supposed to be a very kind of tense, suspenseful thriller type of horror book. Not a thriller. I guess it's kind of a horror book. Like, it's a very tense book. You're not sure what's going to happen. He's trapped in this basement. He's basically kidnapped and locked away. And you're wondering what's going on. And the whole time, the whole thing with the phone is happening. And you're like trying to piece things together. And it's a very interesting idea. I will say, when I closed this story, I was conflicted because I feel like on one hand, if this story was like 20 pages longer, I would have been frustrated at having wasted 40 pages of my reading time. Or it could have been the case where this book or this story really needed another 20, 30, maybe 60 pages to round this out. So instead of maybe a short story of like 20 pages, maybe it could have been a novelette or whatever. I don't know. But to me, I wasn't overly impressed. It didn't leave me like, oh my God, I can't believe that happened. And it also wasn't as scary or as dark or as gripping as I thought. But as a sample of the writing, I enjoyed it. It gave me a lot of Stephen King vibes, which is cool. The idea was cool. And I thought for what it tried to do, it did it pretty well. I think this might be an odd situation or like a unique situation where the adaptation maybe is the right way to go, and it might do the story more justice. I don't know. I haven't seen it. I'm going to check it out at some point, but I'm not in a rush to do that either. But yeah, as far as what it did, cool. It was 3 stars. It was my first Joe Hill, and I definitely will be reading more from him as soon as I find time. All right, the next one I read in December. You can tell I haven't been reading for the last couple months that many books in a month. So that's hence the catch up, because I was like, why bother? So the next one is Stephen King's It. And it was the first time I've read this book by Stephen King. And what can I say? It was my book of the year. It was my #1 book that I read in 2022. if you want to get a better idea of what I liked and hear me gush more coherently much sooner after having finished that book, you can check out the video with my top 5 of 2022. But let me just say, it's one of the best, or I should say it's probably the best coming of age story that I've ever read. The horror elements were well executed. The writing was really good. It's a huge book. It's like 11 or 1200. It's like 1100 pages. And I wouldn't say I flew through it, because like you can't fly through an 1100 page book, but I read it a lot faster than I could have any other book by any other author probably. And I had a lot more fun in the moments in between, you know, the horror stuff and the clown stuff, if you know what I'm talking about, like all of that without spoiling stuff. I had a lot more fun in between just hanging out with the crew, plotting and scheming and being friends, and then being adults and trying to figure out like, what are we going to do? I had a lot more fun doing that than I ever thought I could. Basically, the premise of this is it's a group of friends that, you know, they live in Derry, Maine, and there's this ancient lurking evil that sort of reemerges, and they have to, they take it upon themselves to try and defeat that and get rid of it. And then this isn't really a spoiler because people sort of know the story, and they also know that it jumps back and forth very nicely and very efficiently, in my opinion, between the past when they're children, which is I think at the time the late 50s, and then when they're adults. In the book it's 1985 or it's 80s. In the movie adaptations they crank that up and age it a little bit so that it's 2000 something, and the kids are in the 80s. So it's not really a spoiler to say that the evil isn't necessarily dead and it comes back. And so now they're adults and they're going to have to try and, you know, defeat this evil and figure out a way to solve the problem that exists by it. And so, yeah, it was such a fun book. It was a really good experience. I'm really glad I started it kind of around Halloween, so like end of October, and then it took me the month of November and a bit of December to read it. I think that's kind of how it worked. So if you have not yet read this book by Stephen King, if you're a Stephen King fan or just like a horror fan and for some reason like me, you grew up and just never really got to it, I would highly recommend it. There is that one scene that is kind of problematic involving the kids when they were kids, and it's kind of sexual. I looked past it. I think that it probably didn't need to be there. I think I could have even come up with a few ways to write around that. I understand where he was coming from it, and if you're curious, we can talk offline. I actually don't think it was all that out of context. I just didn't think it needed to quite be done the way that it was done. I understand why it was there and the motivations behind one or two characters where they thought that that scene, what they do in that scene, made the most sense and they needed to do that. I'm not justifying it. I'm not defending it. It really didn't need to be there. It puts a bit of a damper on the end of the book, not gonna lie. But that scene is near the end, and it's a fairly short scene. We're talking about an 1100 page masterpiece. So I had to give it 5 stars. I had to make it my book of the year despite that one scene. And yeah, I thought it was incredibly done. The writing is perfect. It's evocative. It's emotional. It really just hits home. The nostalgia is there. If you grew up in like North America as a child and hung out riding your bikes and stuff with friends and playing, you know, baseball or in the park or whatever, you can feel that camaraderie, and it's a very organic friendship that develops. You end up relating to a couple characters much more than you thought you would. The characters kind of become family because you're with them for almost 1200 pages. So I thought it was incredible. It was my book of the year. If you're curious about some other thoughts or maybe more fresh thoughts, you can check out that video, my top 5 of last year. And yeah, other than that, 5 stars, easy one, probably the easiest 5 stars I've given in a very long time. Another one that I read in the month of December, near the end of the month, it was Christmas time, it was snowing outside, which worked in this book's favor, but even so, it still made it on my most disappointing books of last year. I'll also link that video down below. This one is The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden. This is part of the Winter Night trilogy, I believe. It draws on like Russian folklore, basically tells the story of this young girl with like a special connection to like, not demons, but like folklore creatures and spirits and stuff. It's a very interesting book. I sort of thought it would read a lot more middle grade than it did. It's a little bit darker. There's like basically like zombies and stuff, but anyway, I'm not going to spoil it, and there's a lot more to it than that. This one basically tells the story of Vasya, who's this young girl that has this special connection with the spirits in nature or like folklore type creatures. I'm not going to spoil it, but basically her village is threatened in some way by this dark whatever force or something, and so she needs to kind of navigate and help with that as she learns how to harness that power and that connection-ish. It basically reads very fairy tale like. That's the way that it reads. I'm not saying that that's what it is, but it kind of feels like a fairy tale retelling. Although it is historical fiction, there's some historical characters and stuff, and it takes place in, a certain period in Russia. So it's not like, it's historical fantasy. Let's call it historical fantasy. I can understand why people like this one. It does a lot of things well, I think, for a lot of people. Just for me, the pacing and I didn't really care at the end, I think, to be honest. That's a sign of a book just not maybe being to my taste. I thought objectively it was like a pretty good package. It just didn't do for me what it did for other people. So, this one was just a miss for me. It is what it is. You're allowed to like what you're allowed to like, and vice versa. It tackles a lot of things like the power of belief, and even the main character, she has to deal with gender roles, and she doesn't want to do necessarily the things that are assigned to her as a girl. She thinks she's meant for more, and she wants to be part of the action a little bit. And it tackles those things well enough. What I will say about this book, and the only thing that kept me reading, to be honest with you, is the atmosphere. I read this in December at the end of the year. It was wintertime. It was snowing here. It was cold, and the atmosphere that's created. This book is all atmosphere. And honestly, I needed a little bit more plot. I think this is where the problem is. I need a little bit more plot. I needed a little bit more character development. I need a little bit more, story. I needed to care more. This book relies heavily on its atmosphere. I'm not saying it's light on plot because it's very story driven. Like I said, it almost reads like a children's story, the way that the pacing works and stuff. And there's enough plot there for a lot of people. I think I just needed more. And the atmosphere alone, even though it was amazing and I read it at the perfect time, it just wasn't enough. But then we go from that disappointing book near the end of the year to my favorite book that I've read so far this year in 2023. I think that's the case. Is it the case? It's probably the case. I started 2023 with A Game of Thrones. I don't have to say what A Game of Thrones is or what it's about. I'm not even really going to talk very much about it. What I will do is direct you to my review, my reaction, my gush video. I don't even know what to call this. This was a first-time reader just reacting to this book, kicking themselves for taking so long to read it, and just gushing about it. I basically just review how much I like this book and talk about some characters, talk about the writing. It ended up becoming much more of a review than I thought it would. But yeah, if you're curious, Game of Thrones, loved it. It was my favorite book of the month in January, and I think it's my favorite book that I've read so far this year. So go check that out if you're curious about Game of Thrones. Obviously, one of the easiest 5 stars I've ever given. All right, also in January, I read my first Adrian Tchaikovsky book, and this was a novella called Ogres. You might have heard of it. This is not a lot of people's, but it's a good entry point because it's short, it's interesting, it's sci-fi, and gives you a good sample of his writing, and people really like this as a novella. Novellas are hard because they're either good or they're not, just like everything else, but sometimes they're not good because they're novellas and because they're too short and you just needed, more. I think that this one was the perfect length. I can't remember how long it was, but I remember being this gave me enough, and I don't think I needed more. I think it did what it wanted to do in the amount of pages given very, very well. It's a super poignant story, and it's very relevant. It's sci-fi, very thought-provoking, probably the most thought-provoking short work of literature that I've read. Again, this book is incredibly relevant to society today. Super thought-provoking. I wrote in my review, heavy thematic exploration of justice, slavery, evolution, societal and scientific progress, faith, and the importance of learning from history and not blindly accepting the status quo. I said that this one is going to stay with me, and I think that that's true. Sometimes you get a book that you're going to think of in the future, and this one for me is one that I know it's going to pop up in my head and I'm going to think of for the rest of my life. It was just a very interesting exploration, the way that it does what it does. The ending was a bit of a twist. I sort of saw it coming, but not up until right at the end. And it served a purpose and everything made sense. And this is definitely a story that, and it's short, so it shouldn't be too much of a problem, but I would not DNF this book. Just if you hate it, fine, whatever. I can't tell you what to do. But if you're confused or you're thinking one thing and you're I don't know, I don't know how this is, just continue reading to the end. It's not that many pages. Just read the whole thing and then look back on it and see what you think. This one I gave 5 stars. I don't often, well, it's hard to give 5 stars to very short works, but again, this one does everything it tried to do very, very well. I thought it was an expert novella, and 5 stars. Another one I read in January was Run by Blake Crouch. If you guys know me and you know my channel, you know that I like Blake Crouch a lot. I really enjoy his books. I even made a video on where to start with Blake Crouch, how to read him. There's a lot of different entry points there. If you like sci-fi or fantasy or romance or westerns or thrillers or whatever, you can start in a bunch of different places, and I kind of give a guide on how to read him and what his more popular books and even some of his older ones are about. And in that video, I actually mentioned this one as one that I hadn't read at the time. And this one on paper really should have worked for me. This is basically about a guy that, you know, the world's gone to shit and people are killing each other. There's some unknown phenomenon that has basically turned a lot of the population kind of evil, and just they're acting out violence. And him and his family, they were basically on the radio listing names of people to, you know, go to their house and kill them. And so they were naming names and addresses, and one morning or whatever, he hears his name on the news or on the radio, and he's like, oh my God. So he takes his wife and kids and they jet. And then from that moment on, it's basically nonstop like struggle to like survive and figure out what's going on and like take care of themselves and each other. And all hell has broken loose in this world for these people. So on paper, it was supposed to be a very thrilling, very fast, very dynamic book. A lot of friends really liked this one. I know Mike said he hadn't finished a Blake Crouch book so fast in a long time. This one, for some reason, just didn't work for me. His writing is very suited to the genre. It's quick, choppy, fragmented sentences. It kind of bothered me in this book. Like, it's not as polished as it was or as it is in some of his newer books, and that's fine. I gave that a complete pass. It's fine. It just, the writing just didn't flow as well, and it didn't feel as good to read for some reason. I don't know if it was a mood thing or if I wasn't really in the mood for a thriller, but you know, while the pacing was good, like it actually got kind of bogged down in the middle for me. There were times in the middle of the book where I just kind of wanted things to continue, you know, after a tense situation or like in the middle of some scene where they're traversing or trying to survive or trying to come up with a solution to a problem. I was just like, okay, like we've spent enough time going from this place to that place. Like, let's just get going. And it sucks because you're spending so much time with these characters, with the wife and the kids and the main character and all this stuff, that I didn't like any of the characters. And some would argue that this is a realistic family, that at the very beginning, like page 1, you are told that the marriage isn't 100% and they're a little bit on the rocks. So the dynamic between the parents as they're trying to survive in this like family unit that's forced now to be 100% connected and together is very interesting. My problem was the kids were kind of annoying. Realistic, absolutely, but even the wife and the, you know, some of the situations that they come into, there's some unrealistic actions or solutions that they come up with. I can't give exact examples because I don't really remember. I just remember there were times where the characters were just so annoying and I just didn't really like listening to them. I will give one example of the kind of unrealistic. There's a scenario where he's wearing a backpack and he's trying to get through this, you know, mountain crevasse or whatever, and it's very, very narrow. You can imagine they don't have a lot of supplies. They don't have a lot of stuff. He basically has a bag with like all the important stuff with it. He has his kids with him, the wife, whatever, they're trying to get up. And the way that it's described, like maybe I read it wrong, but the way that it's described was there's not enough room for him to like get through like with the backpack. So he takes his backpack off and like throws it down the mountain. To me, it like you would take stuff out, you would throw something, you know, ahead of you through the crack, and then like you would, I don't know, there must be another way than getting rid of your backpack and throwing it off a cliff. That just didn't make sense to me. So some of the plot scenarios seemed unrealistic, the way they were handled. I think I just didn't like the characters and I didn't really care for the story. The ending left me quite disappointed. I thought it was interesting. His endings are always kind of cool. They always, well, not always. Sometimes they flash back a little bit and they kind of give you an insight as to like what happened, or they flash forward in time kind of as this one does. I don't know. The ending didn't really do anything for me either. And I was left being like, okay, like that was an okay, you know, 3-star thriller. There wasn't a whole lot of sci-fi in it. They kind of they don't really explain, but they allude to the potential of what created this phenomenon. You know what I mean? Like they give a cause to it, but they don't explain why that was the cause. So yeah, the ending was all right. It was a 3-star. I probably rambled a bit too much about that one, but it's a shame because I really like Blake Crouch. So hopefully the next one I pick up is going to be good. I got some other older ones that might work. Yeah, we'll see. So 3-star for Blake Crouch. All right, I ended that month with Empire of the Vampire by Jay Kristoff. That one took me a long time to read. I think I started it in end of November or like beginning of December, and it took me until like January to finish it. And this one is basically about a half vampire, half human guy named Gabriel de Leon, and he's the last of the Silver Saints, which is basically like a vampire hunter group or faction or whatever. I don't really want to give too much away on the plot or the synopsis because there are some twists and turns in there that I thought were really well done, and some interesting developments with some characters. So I'm not going to say too much more other than that. You can give the old Google a try or Goodreads or whatever if you want to know more about what the book is about. A lot of people were talking about this about a year or two ago. Well, about a year ago specifically. I can't remember when it came out. A lot of people enjoyed it. People were raving about it. It was on some people's best book of the year or top books of the year list. I read and reviewed the Nevernight trilogy by Jay Kristoff, and I really enjoyed those books. I had some problems with it, some of the choices that were made and some of the tropes that existed, but overall I really enjoyed it. And from Nevernight, what I got was I liked Jay Kristoff's writing enough. I know that it's not for everybody, and I know that the footnotes in Nevernight weren't for everybody, but I kind of thought they were funny. The humor, the way that it was done, the writing was okay. I don't mind his metaphors and his adjective and the way he describes stuff a little bit too much. I thought the action was cool. The characters were cool. Mia was cool. This is not a review about Nevernight. What am I even doing? For Empire of the Vampire, his writing was really fun at the beginning, and then it kind of turned me off halfway through. And I don't know if I quite got that spark back for his writing through the rest of this book. Now, that might have been because it took me too long to finish this book. I don't really know, but I didn't love it as much as I thought I would. I ended up giving it 4 stars because the action propels you through the last half of the book, and there are a lot of developments in the last half of this book, which I liked the last half more than the first half. The way that the story is told is he's basically chronicling his life. He's sitting across from somebody and he's being like interviewed. He's basically forced to tell his story, and it goes back between the present and the past. It does that an awful lot, and I just felt like it wasn't as smooth as I would have hoped. I think it was done well enough, but every now and then it would pull me out of a moment or out of a situation, and we'd be back in the room when he's chronicling his story, almost like at times for the sake of a joke. It was just annoying. There were a couple points where I literally like said out loud, like, come on, like just, get on with the story and we can bounce back later. Like there were a couple points where we were literally pulled out for almost no reason, and that was kind of frustrating. Now, overall, the story was interesting. The world was incredible. I really liked the world. I liked Gabriel. We have a talking sword, some animal companions, kind of, for some characters. We have some interesting relationships. It explores a lot of different things. And overall, I think that I enjoyed it enough for what it was. I think that this is a book that I think I'm going to reread when the sequel comes out and kind of go back through, take my time with the story, not take my time, enjoy the story, revisit it, and probably read it a little bit faster. I think part of my enjoyment was affected because I took too long with it. And so the impact of some moments maybe didn't land as well. But then also part of me thinks that I should have enjoyed it better for taking a little bit longer with it, just because the bouncing back and forth and some of the things that were kind of annoying to me, I had a little bit more time away from them before I started reading again, like in between. So I don't know. I feel like I should have enjoyed it more than I did. It was a solid 4-star. I enjoyed it enough. I'm curious where the story goes. I didn't find a whole lot of attachment or endearment to like any characters. Gabriel is cool enough for a character, but I don't really care as much as I thought I would. Some of the dialogue choices were a little cringe. I understand where some of the edgelord, whatever, like comments or criticisms come from. As a fan of Jay Kristoff, I was able to back out enough and kind of just enjoy it for what it was. It was a vampire story in this cool world with some crazy fucking action and gore and blood and sex. It was cool. Like, it was good. It just, I thought that it would be a little bit more, like the impression would be a little bit more lasting. And I don't think it is. I'll wait and see how the sequel turns out. But yeah, for now, it was a 4. And I'd recommend it if you like vampire stuff. And if you've liked Nevernight, you're probably going to enjoy this one too. The next book is one that really shouldn't have worked for me on paper. I don't even know what prompted me to pick this up. I think it's because the audio version of it was narrated quite well and it's free on Audible. It's a pretty short book, so I thought might as well fit it in. A lot of people were talking about it. There was buzz about it. A lot of people enjoyed it. And it's weird. Like, I gave it 5 stars. It's a book about a guy named William Stoner. You start following him when he's younger through his family life and stuff. And then he goes off to school and eventually becomes a English, professor and becomes, tenured at his school. It just is about his life. It's a very ordinary story about this very mundane guy in his life. And it just really creeps up on you and it becomes surprisingly emotional near the end. You become very attached to William Stoner and the hardships he endures in his life with his wife and his friends and colleagues and his daughter. That relationship is tested and all of his relationships are tested. And his whole life is one big test and one big challenge. And life is difficult. Adulting is difficult, and finding your passion and trying to share that and then getting shit on by life sometimes is all very difficult. And so this one was just an incredibly expert exploration of the contrast between joy and sorrow and a life well lived, but also what could have been and life's regrets. Very interesting book. Can't even really explain why I liked it or why it worked. Like I said, it creeps up on you. I gave it 5 stars. I really enjoyed it. I'd recommend this if you like literary fiction, just normal books. I don't know, normal books, I guess. Yeah, I think this one is interesting to fit in. It's a short, free audiobook. Give it a shot. Let me know what you think. 5 stars for me. I also read Harry Potter, and in Canada, it's The Philosopher's Stone. I'm just gonna gloss over that one. We all know Harry Potter. It was a 5-star read again. It was just a nostalgia buddy read. I'm gonna fit those in here and there, scatter them through my normal TBRs. Whenever I have time, I have the Jim Dale narration, which I love. He's my dude. And yeah, I'm not gonna talk too much about those ones for that and other reasons. So let's just skip past and we'll go to Never Die by Rob J. Hayes. I read Never Die. This is the first standalone book in his Mortal Techniques standalone series. There's, I believe, 3 out right now. I own the other 2. This one was really cool. This was, a ragtag group of unlikely companions and heroes. This one's tough. I really don't want to give too much away on the plot, but basically they come together and it's an adventure quest fantasy. They have to go and do this task, and you have people of different styles of fighting and different powers. Everybody has these special abilities and they're all kind of like martial arts superheroes by themselves, and they come together for a purpose. The way they all complement each other and the way that each character is written, there's just enough background and lore to keep you interested, but it's a very short, snappy, extremely fast-paced book, which I loved. I read it at the right time. It was exactly what I wanted. Super fun adventure, martial arts, fantasy, like romp. From page 1, it kicks off. The characters are compelling. The way they interact is really fun to be part. You always know who's talking, who's speaking. Everybody has their own flair. Every character feels very unique, but the way they come together, it's one of those situations where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And that's kind of what you get here. That you have this whole group of people, and the dynamic between all of them when they finally come together and go do what they're supposed to do is super fun to read. There's really cool relationships in here, some fun arcs for certain characters. Like, I just really liked it. If you like adventure, skills, martial arts, fighting, adventure, quest, fantasy, quick-paced books, magic, and satisfying like atmosphere and world building in a very contained kind of story, I think that you would enjoy it. I gave this one a 4.5 out of 5. I should probably round up my stars on Goodreads to 5 stars because they don't give us halves. So yeah, I gave it a 4.5. I'm really eager to continue. Rob J. Hayes writes really well. It was a very polished self-pub book. I believe it's self-pub as far as I know, it still is. So yeah, super polished, really enjoyed it, and surprisingly complex characters and just enough of everything to make it really satisfying. The next one was actually going to be like a buddy read with my wife. She's actually still finishing it. She's reading a bunch of stuff. So to date, we haven't had time to really talk about it or do a joint review. But this one was Octavia E. Butler's Kindred, written in 1979. I gave this one 4.5 out of 5 stars. I thought it was very close to perfect. It was really cool the way that it did what it did. It's basically about this black woman who gets transported from, I believe, the 70s when it was written, to the past, to the early 1800s in the South, where slavery was a thing and normal. And it was a very interesting read and very much outside of my comfort zone. It's unflinching in the way that it explains and describes some of the treatment of people. This one reads like literary fiction. There's not a whole lot of hard sci-fi in it. It's really only the fact that she finds herself in the past and then in the present a few times, and it kind of glosses over how that's done or why or whatever. I mean, you kind of find a connection later as to why this might be happening, but the sci-fi is not really the focus of the story. It's the story and the story that it's trying to tell, the characters, the hardship, the life, and the conflict that this character is experiencing and having to reconcile her life and what she knows with what she's experiencing and witnessing in this crazy, very difficult, very traumatic past. And so the way that that's done is incredible. I really like the writing. Some of the themes are agency and power and oppression and love and sacrifice and justice and hope and, a lot of things. This book does a lot of things in a very short amount of time, and I can't recommend it enough. Its message, super important. Trigger warnings, like I said, daily life of slavery. It can be graphic, mistreatment of like women and children occasionally. It doesn't really fade to black. It kind of does explain how things were, and it's not overly descriptive or overly gory or shocking or anything like that. It doesn't gloss over some of the mistreatment and some of the things that were happening. But yeah, I won't ramble too much more. I gave this one a 4.5 out of 5 stars, and I would highly recommend it. Next up, last month, I read The Road by Cormac McCarthy for the very first time. I'm gonna gloss over this one, 5 stars. I loved the book. It was incredibly moving and powerful. It was almost like a short little masterpiece, I think, in its own way, what it tried to do. I gave this one a dedicated review, so I'll put that up here. You can go check that out if you're curious about my specific thoughts and what I liked. And I actually do a little bit of a spoiler discussion interpreting the book and its themes and why I thought it was important, what it was trying to do, and how I interpreted it, which is basically as one giant metaphor. I talk about that at the end of that video, so there's ample spoiler warnings. Go check out that review. And if you've read it, maybe you can chime in the comments spoiler free and let me know your thoughts, how it affected you. It was incredibly moving. I would recommend it to a lot of people. It's not meant for everyone. Very poetic writing. Cormac McCarthy is super impressive. I just not sure where I go from here because Blood Meridian was a very interesting experience. Can't really say I enjoyed it, but like, wow, like holy crap, like what a book. The Road, I kind of enjoyed for its cathartic, kind of like, depressing feeling and just the way that it makes you feel and makes you think about your own life and it's a little existential. So I enjoyed that one. I just don't know where to go from here because his writing is interesting and it's not for everyone. So if you have Cormac McCarthy recommendations, I don't know when I would pick up another book. You really have to be in a specific mood for that. It's definitely not a pick-me-up type of book. So yeah, not sure where to go from there, but it was a 5-star and I'm glad I finally read it. The next book, and one that I won't talk too much about yet, just in case I'm on some live show discussions or do it maybe a dedicated review or whatever. The last one is A Clash of Kings by George R.R. Martin. This is book 2 in A Song of Ice and Fire. I just finished that one up and yeah, I loved it. I gave it 4.5 stars out of 5. I gave it 5 on Goodreads, but it didn't quite live up to Game of Thrones for me. I didn't have the excitement of reading the first book for the first time and being like so immersed in everything. A lot of the same characters that I really enjoyed, one or two couple new ones, I think. And, just the atmosphere, the world, everything I loved about Game of Thrones is still here, but it did feel like it was a little slower. And while the last third of this book just pops off, it was a lot of buildup. And I felt like I know that there's some epic shit on the horizon in this series from what I gather and what people have told me. And so, I kind of just want to get to Storm of Swords. And while this book felt like a lot of buildup, the last little bit really made me shoot this one up another star probably. With the first one, I couldn't help but just let it simmer and, you know, think about how much I enjoyed this and how awesome the characters were and everything I loved about being immersed in this world and just the writing, because this was my first experience with George R.R. Martin's writing in the first book. This one, I didn't sit and think about it as much. It just makes me excited to read the next book, if that makes sense. So there were a couple times where I was just eager to continue on, and there was a lot of setup, although, you know, the book is punctuated with some really iconic scenes and really, really fun moments. I just wanted to kind of get through to the next book. So I'm not sitting and thinking about how much I enjoyed this one like I did with Game of Thrones, but it did a very good job about continuing and building some momentum at the end and getting me extremely excited to continue with the series with A Storm of Swords, which is, I guess, what a book 2 and so on is supposed to do. It's supposed to give you just enough, but keep you having fun. And I know that subsequent books all have their moments and their kind of like epic pieces to them. I'm excited to continue with the series. I loved this book, not quite as much as Game of Thrones, but I still give it a 5 stars on Goodreads, 4.5 if you care. I think that brings us up to speed for February, and I think for March, I'm going to try and stay up to date with my wrap-ups so I don't have a big build up like this, so I don't have to ramble for way too long. This video is probably way too long. So yeah, I think even if I only read 2-3 books a month or whatever I'm able to get through for a specific month, I think I'll still just try and do a wrap up so I can give you guys my thoughts. Anyway, I've rambled long enough. If you stayed this long, I appreciate it. Subscribe if you haven't. Thank you so much. I'll catch you guys real soon on the next video.